I have presided over tens of thousands of cases. I have seen angry neighbors, deceitful business partners, and families torn apart by greed. I have watched liars sweat and thieves crumble when confronted with the truth. But nothing quite prepares you for a defendant who walks into a courtroom already planning to put the judge on trial. Her name was Brenda Sterling. She stepped through the heavy wooden doors of my courtroom not with the cautious hesitation of someone facing a lawsuit, but with the brisk, impatient stride of a CEO arriving late to a meeting where she intended to fire everyone. She wore a tailored ivory suit, a designer handbag clutched tightly under her arm, and her smartphone was already gripped firmly in her right hand. That phone would soon become the center of the most bizarre and explosive escalation I have ever witnessed on the bench. Standing across from her at the plaintiff's table was David Vance. David looked exactly how victims of long-term neighborhood bullying always look, completely drained. His shoulders were slumped, his hands nervously organizing a thick stack of printed emails, repair receipts, and photographs. The contrast between the two of them told the story before a single word was spoken on the record. Years of watching human behavior have taught me one undeniable truth. Arrogance screams, but exhaustion leaves a paper trail. The case itself seems standard. David was suing Brenda for property damage and emotional distress. According to his complaint, Brenda had spent the last 8 months waging a psychological war over a shared property line. She had allegedly destroyed his landscaping and repeatedly called city code enforcement with completely fabricated violations just to harass him. When I called the case to order, Brenda didn't step up to the podium. She glided to it. She placed her phone face up on the wooden stand, tapped the screen once, and looked up at me with a smirk. It is the cold, calculated smile of someone who believes that wealth, status, or sheer audacity makes them immune to consequences. She looked around the room as if the bailiff, the gallery, and the judge were merely background extras in her own personal reality show. I asked David to state his claim. Before he could finish his first sentence, Brenda interrupted. "Your Honor, this is a waste of my time. This man is obsessed, and I am documenting this entire farce." I leaned forward. "Ma'am, you will speak when spoken to, and you will put that device away immediately." Brenda lifted her chin. "I don't have to put it away. In fact, I am currently drafting a lawsuit against you for judicial harassment." The murmur in the gallery wasn't shock. It was electricity. People shift in their seats when they are uncomfortable, but they lean forward when they know they are about to witness a collision. I looked at Brenda Sterling, taking in the defiant set of her jaw and the way she held her phone like a shield. "A lawsuit for judicial harassment?" I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly level. In a courtroom, the person who raises their voice first usually loses control of the room. "And on what grounds exactly are you basing this hypothetical lawsuit, Miss Papin?" "Sterling?" Brenda smiled, a tight, thin stretching of her lips. "On the grounds that you are allowing this unstable individual," she gestured dismissively toward David, "to drag my name through the mud with baseless accusations. You are facilitating his harassment, which makes you complicit, and I have every right to record this proceeding for my own protection." I glanced at my bailiff, Officer Miller, who had already taken a half step toward Brenda's podium. He looked at me, waiting for the nod. I shook my head slightly. Not yet. I needed Brenda to put every ounce of her arrogance on the record. "Miss Sterling," I said, folding my hands, "you are in a court of law, not a press conference. There are strict rules regarding recording devices in this room, which are posted clearly on the door you just walked through. You are currently in violation of those rules. I will tell you one last time, put the phone away." "Or what?" Brenda challenged, her voice ringing out clearly. "You'll hold me in contempt? Go ahead. My attorney will have a field day with this. I'm a respected member of this community. I sit on the board of 3 charities. You cannot treat me like a common criminal." There it was, the classic defense of the entitled. She wasn't arguing the facts of the case. She was arguing her status. She truly believed that her social standing acted as a force field against the rules everyone else had to follow. I looked over at David Vance. He was watching Brenda with a mix of dread and vindication. This was exactly what he had been dealing with for 8 months. The unyielding, impenetrable wall of a person who refused to acknowledge reality if it inconvenienced them. "This is not about your charity work, Miss Sterling," I replied. "This is about the $4,500 in property damage Mr. Vance claims you caused, and the multiple false reports you allegedly filed with city officials. Now, we can proceed with this hearing, or we can discuss your contempt charge. Which will it be?" Brenda glared at me, her eyes narrowing. She picked up her phone, but she didn't put it in her purse. Instead, she started tapping the screen rapidly. "I am not participating in this kangaroo court," she announced. "I'm calling the police. I need an officer here immediately to report a hostile environment and judicial misconduct." Officer Miller stepped forward again. "Ma'am, hand me the phone." "Don't you dare touch me," Brenda snapped, recoiling as if Miller had threatened her with a weapon. "I am dialing 911 right now. We'll see how you like it when real authority gets involved." Par trois. The courtroom, usually a place of shuffling papers and quiet coughs, was now dead silent. It was the specific kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Officer Miller stopped. He was a veteran bailiff, a man who had diffused physical fights and handled screaming defendants. But this was different. He looked to me for instruction, his hand hovering near his utility belt. "Let her make the call," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. Both David and Officer Miller looked at me in disbelief. Brenda's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought my instruction to let her dial was a concession to her power, a surrender to her threats. "Smart decision," Brenda muttered, lifting the phone to her ear. What Brenda didn't understand, and what many arrogant people fail to grasp, is that a courtroom is not a negotiation table. It is a stage built entirely for the exposure of truth. I didn't let her make the call because I was intimidated. I let her make the call because I wanted her actions, her entitlement, and her blatant misuse of emergency services cemented onto the official record. When a bully hangs themselves, the judge's only job is to provide the rope. We all waited. The tinny ringtone echoed slightly in the quiet room. "Yes, 911? This is Brenda Sterling. I am currently inside courtroom 4B at the municipal courthouse, and I am reporting an emergency," she said, her voice dripping with artificial distress. "I am being held in a hostile environment by an aggressive plaintiff and a judge who is refusing to uphold the law. I need officers dispatched immediately to escort me out safely." There was a pause as the operator responded. I could faintly hear the confusion on the other end of the line. "No, there are no weapons," Brenda snapped, annoyed that her narrative was being questioned. "The emergency is that my civil rights are being violated. Just send the police." She ended the call and placed the phone back on the podium, crossing her arms. She looked at David, then at me. "They are on their way." "Thank you, Miss Sterling," I said calmly. "Now that you have concluded your emergency report, we will proceed with the evidence. Mr. Vance, you mentioned you have security footage?" David blinked, pulling himself out of his shock. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a flash drive with 3 clips." "This is ridiculous," Brenda interjected. "You can't proceed when the police are en route." "Miss Sterling," I replied, "the police handle criminal emergencies outside these doors. Inside these doors, I handle the proceedings. Officer Miller, please take the flash drive and cue up the video." The bailiff took the small drive from David's trembling hand and inserted it into the courtroom computer. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. The first clip was black and white, time-stamped 2:14 a.m. It showed David's front yard, a meticulously manicured lawn with a small stone retaining wall. Suddenly, a figure walked into the frame. The figure was wearing a dark hoodie, but the posture, the distinct walk, and the designer sneakers were unmistakable. It was Brenda. She walked directly to the retaining wall, pulled a small crowbar from her pocket, and began systematically dismantling the stones, tossing them onto David's driveway. "That's edited," Brenda said immediately, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "That's not me." "Play the next clip," I instructed. The second video was in full color, taken during daylight hours. It showed Brenda standing on her side of the property line, holding a garden hose. She was aiming it directly at the exhaust vent of David's central air conditioning unit, flooding it with water. David could be heard off-camera yelling, "Brenda, stop! You're going to destroy the motor!" Brenda looked directly into the camera lens, smiled that same cold smile, and said, "Sue me." The courtroom let out a collective breath. David lowered his head. Brenda's face flushed a deep, angry red. That is completely out of context," she stammered, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. "He started it. Play the third clip," I said softly. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the computer processor as the third video loaded. This clip was different. It wasn't captured by David's front porch cameras. It was recorded on a neighbor's high-definition doorbell camera across the street. The timestamp in the corner placed it just 3 weeks prior, right around the time David's lawsuit was officially filed. On the screen, Brenda was standing at the very edge of her driveway, talking loudly on her cell phone. Because the suburban street was dead quiet, the sensitive microphone picked up her voice with crystal clarity. She was pacing back and forth, her designer heel clicking aggressively against the pavement. "Listen to me," Brenda's recorded voice echoed through the breathless courtroom. "I don't care if you have to invent a zoning violation out of thin air. David Vance is a menace. I want his property cited every single week until he is forced out. If the city won't do it, I'll just start calling the police and say he's trespassing on my grass. I'll tell them he's unhinged and I feel physically threatened. Who are they going to believe? Me or that pathetic little man?" The digital Brenda laughed a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the wooden walls of my courtroom. The real Brenda, standing frozen at the defendant's podium, had gone completely pale. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking almost ghostly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Her mouth opened, but for the first time all morning, no words came out. I have seen many people caught in lies over my decades on the bench, but witnessing an arrogant manipulator realize that their own voice has betrayed them is a unique spectacle. The psychological armor she had worn into the room, the tailored suit, the confident smirk, the delusion of absolute control shattered in a single instant. She looked frantically around the gallery, searching the faces of strangers for an escape route, an excuse, or someone to blame. She found nothing but disgusted, unblinking stares. That audio has been doctored," Brenda whispered, her voice suddenly shaking. Her polished composure was entirely gone. "This is a setup. You are all colluding against me." Before I could even begin to address her absurd accusation, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung wide open. 2 uniformed city police officers stepped inside, their radios crackling softly in the silent room. They scanned the gallery, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, their expressions serious. They were responding to a priority 911 call from a woman claiming she was trapped in a hostile environment, being terrorized by a dangerous man and a rogue judge. Brenda's eyes lit up with a desperate manic relief. She pointed a trembling finger at me and then whipped her hand around to point directly at David Vance. "Officers, finally," Brenda shouted, her voice echoing with faux panic. "Detain him. Arrest both of them." The 2 officers did not lunge forward to slap cuffs on David. They did not storm my bench. Instead, they stopped just inside the wooden swinging doors, their hands resting neutrally on their duty belts, assessing the room with the trained, calculated eyes of veteran law enforcement. They looked at Brenda, flushed and screaming. They looked at David, who was sitting completely still, looking more bewildered than dangerous. And finally, they looked at my bailiff, Officer Miller. Miller gave them a single subtle shake of his head. No threat. "Ma'am," the taller of the 2 officers said, his voice a low, steady rumble that completely contrasted with Brenda's hysterical pitch. "Are you the individual who dialed 911, reporting a hostage situation and physical endangerment?" "Yes," Brenda cried out, stepping out from behind the defendant's table. She gestured wildly toward David. "This man has been harassing me, stalking me, and this so-called judge is refusing to follow the law. They are colluding against me. I demanded to leave and I was threatened with jail time. You need to escort me out of here and arrest him immediately." It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon to watch a person who is accustomed to absolute obedience suddenly collide with the brick wall of reality. Brenda had spent her entire life using her wealth and status as a weapon. She called the police not because she was actually in danger, but because she viewed them as her personal customer service representatives summoned to fix a situation she no longer liked. She believed her expensive suit and confident tone would instantly validate her narrative. The officer didn't move toward David. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad. "Ma'am, you stated to dispatch that there was a physical emergency, that you were trapped." "I am trapped," Brenda insisted, her voice growing more shrill as the terrifying realization set in that her performance wasn't working. "Are you blind? Look at this environment. This man is a menace." I finally broke my silence. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy oak of the bench. "Officers," I said clearly, ensuring the court microphone caught every single syllable. "I am the presiding judge in this courtroom. There is no hostage situation here. There is no physical emergency. What you are currently responding to is a defendant who realized she was about to lose a civil case and decided to manufacture a crisis." Brenda spun toward me, her eyes wide with a manic fury. "You cannot speak to them. I called them." "Miss Sterling," I replied, my voice dropping to that dangerous, icy quiet that every experienced judge eventually masters. You do not own the police, and you certainly do not own my courtroom. I turned my attention back to my bailiff, who was still standing by the evidence computer. Officer Miller, I instructed calmly, would you please rewind and replay that third video clip for our newly arrived guests? Officer Miller didn't hesitate. He tapped the keyboard, and the large monitor flared to life once more. The two city police officers stood perfectly still, their eyes locked on the screen. The high-definition footage played, and Brenda Sterling's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom, completely unbothered and utterly damning. I don't care if you have to invent a zoning violation. I'll just start calling the police and say he's trespassing. I'll tell them he's unhinged and I feel physically threatened. Who are they going to believe? Me? Or that pathetic little man? The video ended. The screen faded to black, leaving the courtroom steeped in a heavy, suffocating silence. I watched the two officers. The taller one slowly turned his head away from the blank monitor and locked his eyes directly onto Brenda. The shift in his demeanor was absolute. He was no longer looking at a victim in distress. He was looking at a suspect caught in a lie. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice stripped of all polite deference, "is that your voice on the recording?" Brenda backed up until her hip hit the wooden edge of the defendant's table. It's edited," she stammered, her hands flying up defensively. "He spliced audio together? I have money, officers. I am a board member." "I didn't ask about your finances," the officer interrupted, stepping closer. "I asked if that was you detailing a plan to weaponize the police department, because you just called 911 claiming you were being held hostage in a courtroom. A claim that appears to be entirely fabricated." Brenda's chest heaved. The polished, untouchable aura was gone, replaced by the frantic hyperventilation of a trapped animal. "You can't do this! I am the victim! He is stalking me!" I struck my gavel once, a sharp crack that cut through her hysteria. "Miss Sterling, the only person doing any stalking, harassing, and intimidating is standing at your podium." The second officer pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink was the loudest sound in the room. "Brenda Sterling," he said, "you are being detained for the misuse of the 911 emergency system and filing a false police report." "No! Get your hands off me!" Brenda shrieked, pulling her arm away violently. But privilege does not overpower the law. They grabbed her wrists, firmly pinning them behind her back. The struggle was brief, but it was undeniably ugly. Brenda Sterling, a woman who had walked into my courtroom 30 minutes earlier acting like she owned the building, was now physically wrestling with two armed police officers. Her designer handbag crashed to the floor, spilling its expensive contents across the linoleum, but she didn't even seem to notice. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, her voice cracking as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? I will have both of your badges by the end of the day. I will sue this entire city." The taller officer didn't even blink. People who truly hold power rarely need to remind you of it. Those who scream about their status are usually terrified of losing it. "You have the right to remain silent," he said calmly, completely unbothered by her frantic threats. "I strongly suggest you start using it." They turned her around and marched her down the center aisle. The gallery, packed with people waiting for their own cases, parted like the Red Sea. Nobody whispered. Nobody pulled out a phone to record. They just watched in stunned fascination as a woman who believed she was entirely above the law was forcefully dragged out by the very authority she had tried to weaponize against an innocent man. When the heavy wooden doors finally swung shut behind them, cutting off Brenda's fading screams in the hallway, the courtroom descended into a profound, echoing silence. It was the sound of reality reasserting itself. It was the sound of privilege collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. I let the silence hang for a few moments, allowing the gravity of the situation to settle over the room. Then, I turned my attention back to the plaintiff's table. David Vance was gripping the edges of his wooden desk. He wasn't smiling or celebrating. He was staring at the empty space where Brenda had just been standing, his chest rising and falling heavily. Tears were welling in his eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. For 8 months, he had been gaslit and tormented by someone who told him that no one would ever believe his story. "Mr. Vance," I said gently, ensuring my voice was completely stripped of the harshness I had used earlier. He blinked, looking up at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor?" "You can breathe now," I told him. "The truth is on the record." David nodded slowly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his face. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply gathered his scattered papers with hands that finally, after nearly a year of relentless psychological torment, had stopped shaking. I looked down at the complaint, adjusted my reading glasses, and made my ruling clear and absolute. Mr. Vance, I am awarding you the maximum limit allowable in this court, $5,000 for the documented property damage, the destroyed landscaping, and the security equipment you were forced to install. Furthermore, I am forwarding this court's official transcript, along with all video and audio exhibits, directly to the district attorney's office. They will need it to process Miss Sterling's pending criminal charges for misuse of emergency services and filing a false report. Thank you, Your Honor, David whispered. You don't need to thank me, I replied. You came prepared. You brought the facts. The law did the rest. I strongly advise you to file for a permanent protective order the moment you leave this building. I have a feeling, Miss Sterling will be too preoccupied with her own legal defense to bother you for a very long time. As I struck the gavel to officially close the case, I looked out over the gallery. The spectators were still processing what they had just witnessed. They had come to court expecting to see minor arguments over unpaid rent or scratched bumpers. Instead, they got a masterclass in hubris. Brenda Sterling is a perfect example of what happens when privilege lives in a vacuum. She had surrounded herself with people who never told her no, living in a bubble where her money and her husband's name acted as a universal currency to buy her way out of bad behavior. When she stepped into my courtroom, she assumed that same currency would work on the justice system. She believed her authority was something she could impose simply by raising her voice and picking up a phone. But a courtroom is the great equalizer. It does not care about the designer label on your suit, the board seats you hold, or the square footage of your estate. When power fails, character is the only thing left standing on the record. Under pressure, Brenda's character was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell of intimidation. I stepped down from the bench that afternoon and thought about David Vance walking to his car, finally free from the shadow of his bully. Cases like this remind me why I put on the black robe every single day. True justice isn't just about financial restitution. It is the moment a manipulator's smoke and mirrors are blown away, and the victim is finally told by the world, "You are not crazy. We see them, and we stop them."